pioneer scrapbook of Jimmie and Thelma Dean portrays two down-to-earth people who had an excellent eye for horses. With Thelma by his side, Jimmie worked for other horse owners and breeders most of his life, managing their farms and horse operations. People who sought him out for his common-sense advice and knowledge of horses later became lifelong friends. Both honest and ethical people, Jimmie was the diplomat, while Thelma, called Mom by her husband, shot from the hip. Friends often remarked, "You always knew where you stood with Mom." James Parker Dean was the product of 3 generations of horsemen and women. His paternal grandfather trained and sold matched pairs of carriage horses, horses who were, in Jimmie's words, the Cadillacs of their day.
My grandfather had Arabian Stallion brought to him in about 1918, 17 or 18. And he wanted it broke to drive in traffic. We bred quite a few of the saddle and harness horse mares to him. And I liked it, the horse, and it wasn't until about 1926 or 27 that I even knew they had a registry for them.
Thelma's and Jimmie's families lived less than 10 miles apart in Kentucky. They were married in October 1929. Jimmie always admired Thelma's horsemanship.
She could ride a horse just like an Indian. She never used any saddles. She just run and hit their back and put them in high gear and take off. It was cheaper to marry than it was to hire her.
The stock market crashed in October 1929. Jimmie's blacksmith, garage, and farming business started to feel the pressure of the Great Depression. Then, in 1933, Jimmie and Thelma's only child, Robert Perry Dean, was born. By 1934, Jimmie, like millions of Americans, needed a job.
A friend of mine was the manager of the mare department of Selby Stud. Mr. Selby had one of the best, really the top herd of saddle horses. I went up and talked to him and told him that I'd like to have a job until things kind of settled down. And I went up there to train and show the saddle horses.
Jimmie was also attracted to Selby Stud because it had one of the few herds of Arabian horses in America.
Mr. Selby just had the Arabians for his own pleasure. They weren't doing anything with them.
In 1934, Jimmie and Thelma Dean moved with their infant son from Kentucky to Selby Stud in Portsmouth, Ohio. This was the beginning of a working relationship that lasted nearly 2 decades. Roger Selby, a highly successful shoe manufacturer, often traveled through Europe on business. On those trips, Selby visited Crabbett Stud in England to view and often buy Arabian horses from Lady Wentworth. Altogether, Selby imported 4 groups of horses from Crabbett. Many are familiar to Arabian horse enthusiasts. 1928, Mirzam, Karima, Indea, and Rifala. 1930, Mirage, Kayama, Hilwi, Selmnab, Raselma, Jarama, Namilla, Rasmina, and Rose of France. 1932, Rahal, Selmian, Raffles, Menzel, and Rishafia. And the last importation in 1933, Rimini and Uredin II. Lady Wentworth drove a hard bargain, according to Jimmie's recounting of the 1932 importation.
He had 5 or 6 horses, and he thought the price was a little too high on them, but she never would come down on any of the prices she made. She'd always work around to throw another horse in or make some kind of a change in this. And in this particular time, she threw in this little Arabian Stallion that was sterile, but she thought he'd make a good riding horse for the children. I think she knew at the time, but didn't tell him that he wasn't a child's horse.
That little Arabian stallion was Raffles, His sire was Skowronek, and his dam, Rafala, was a Skowronek daughter. Foaled in 1926, Raffles was a beautiful animal. However, he had learned to distrust humans, and as a stallion, Raffles had a serious problem.
He had been sent to the Royal Veterinary College in London and pronounced hopelessly sterile. And when he came over here, Mr. Selby sent him up to Ohio State to see if they could determine what his problem was, but they were never able to. Their conclusion at the end of there was that he was hopelessly sterile. The horse would breed a mare, but he had only seminal fluid. There was no sperm.
Jimmie and Thelma decided to try to improve Raffles' fertility. Jimmie had done a lot of reading about the relationship between hypertension and sexual dysfunction in men. He believed he could apply those findings to Raffles. After chores were done at Selby Stud, Jimmie and Thelma began working with Raffles in earnest during the winter of 1935.
We would just play with him and feed him apples and carrots. And finally, we got to the point where we decided that we'd try to ride him. I led him and told her to walk right behind me and put her hand on his back while she was walking, and we got to the point where I put my hand back and she stepped up in it, slid over on his back, and he went right straight up in the air. She just put her arms around his neck and patted him and talked to him, and he walked 2 or 3 steps on his hind legs. And then he just come down and go up, come down and go up. And she just kept talking and patting him. We went through that rigmarole for a couple of weeks. Right behind the farm was a large acreage of Forest Service land. It had fire trails all around through it. After breakfast was over in the morning, she would get on him and go into that forest preserve and sometimes ride him clear up till dark. All day she'd take her lunch with her. And we did that up until April.
That spring, 1936, was the test for Jimmie and Thelma's patient and dedicated efforts. Jimmie bred Raffles to 2 pony mares that were kept for the children to ride. The pony mares settled. The following year, Jimmie bred Raffles to the Arabian mares Indea and Rishafia, and they both foaled in 1938. Lady Wentworth suddenly became interested in Raffles again.
After we got Raffles to breeding, she wanted to buy him back. And Mr. Selby wouldn't sell her, and then she wouldn't sell him any more horses.
Indea's colt Indraf would later become the foundation stallion for Basie Tankersley's Almara Arabians. Rishafia and her filly, Raffia by Raffles, became foundation mares for L.W. Van Fleet. Raffles' foals created an immediate sensation.
Their heads were shorter and wider, and they had more of a dish in them, and they had more animation and more presence than the majority of the other foals did. Everybody that came noticed and wanted to know if that was a different strain of Arabians. It was the Skowronek influence that made the difference in it.
Another Selby import from Kravitz Stud was the desert-bred stallion Mirage. Mirage was sweet-tempered, pure white, and beautiful, full of fire and presence.
Mirage is one of the best individual proofs of that kind of a disposition comes down as a heritage from there, because he was raised in the desert. I don't think there's any way that you could improve on his disposition, because Mr. Selby's daughter and my son were both little when we had him, and they had a playhouse in his stall where they had kept their toys and things, and they'd make mud pies and try to feed them to him and try to put them in his mouth, and he'd spit them out and he'd get mud all over his face. And I wouldn't have hesitated at all to put a baby in his manger and go away and leave it.
The Mirage son Image, out of Rafala, and Raffles became two of the leading stallions of Selby stud. Roger Selby left the management of his Arabian herd completely up to Jimmie, from breeding decisions to sales. From 1934 to 1949, Selby stud became one of the major Arabian horse farms. As interest in Arabian horses grew, more and more people began to visit Selby's, to buy horses, and to learn from Jimmie Dean. Jimmie and Thelma made everyone feel welcome.
My grandfather drilled this into me too. He said, never judge a person offhand when they come. He said, treat them all courteously and give them all the same amount of attention. And it don't make any difference if whether they wear their overalls or a dress suit.
These first visits to Selby stud established lifelong friendships and business relationships with people who became important Arabian horse breeders. Daniel C. Gainey flew in on his private plane from Owatonna, Minnesota. Jimmie sold Gainey his first Arabian mare, Regima by Mirage, out of Karima. This was the first of many transactions during a long and cherished friendship. Jimmie remembers his first meeting with L.W. Van Fleet from Boulder, Colorado.
He had a great big Packard sedan, and he brought his secretary with him. They had fixed in this back end of this thing, so when you raised the top up, you could pull out a typewriter, and then at night we'd go down to the hotel and still talk horses until the dining room was closed and everybody's gone. We just had one waitress left in there, and Mr. Van Vliet to go over and says, here, honey, and he gave her a $20 bill, says, you go ahead home, we'll turn out the lights. And we'd sit there in the dining room and talk horses sometimes at midnight or after.
Basie Tankersley visited Selby's for the first time when she was a teenager.
There's a taxi cab drove in the barnyard there one morning about 10 o'clock. This little girl got out of it and walked over and asked me if I was Mr. Dean, and I said yes. She said, I'm going to raise Arabian horses, and you're supposed to know all about Arabian horses, and I want to get some information from you. And she just asked questions like a machine gun, and she was going to start right in then, buying the horses and go to raising horses. And I said, what you should do is go back and finish your education, and I'll get you some mares together, and then if you still want to raise horses, why, I'll help you get started, but I think you ought to go back and finish your school first. I didn't sit very well with her, but...
That first meeting was the beginning of a long friendship and business association between Basie and Jimmie. Visitors and potential buyers were likely to be put to work by Thelma, in the field or in the kitchen, peeling potatoes for a spur-of-the-moment dinner for 20. The list of people who visited the Deans, bought Selby horses from them, and sat around their kitchen table reads like the who's who of early Arabian horse breeders in America. Bill and May Munson, Shalimar Arabians. Jeanette Morrill, Bear Claw Ranch. The Manions, Manion Canyon Arabians. Margaret Shuey, Sunny Acres. Alice Payne, Asil Arabians. And R.B. Field, Bent River Arabian Horse Farm. The respect people had for Jimmie and Thelma helped to establish the far-reaching influence of the Selby Arabians in America. Roger Selby even sent Jimmie to represent him at meetings of the Arabian Horse Registry, conducted by Registry President Albert W. Harris.
If you brought up something at the meeting and Mr. Harris wasn't agreed with or not particularly interested in, he'd just take his hearing aid out, lay it on the desk, and let you argue.
In January of 1949, Raffles broke his leg just above the hock. Because Raffles was 23 years old at the time and the nature of the break, everyone advised Jimmie to put Raffles down. But Thelma wouldn't hear of it. Jimmie put his engineering skills to work to save Raffles from destruction.
So I built this frame around him and then put this sling on him, and put him inside of that. We had pulleys on it so that every hour I would let him down and take the pressure off of his belly and chest in order that there wouldn't be any accumulation of fluid. And two things that we were worried about besides the healing of the bone was pneumonia and colic. From that time on until we turned him out, there was never a minute there wasn't somebody in that stall with him. We slept right in the stall in front of him where I could put my hand on him. Had him in there from in January until April.
Raffles' leg healed without complications. It was so remarkable that the attending veterinarians wrote an article about it. When Raffles fully recovered, Jimmie told Roger Selby that he and Thelma wanted to return home to Kentucky. In the past, Selby had studiously ignored all of Jimmie's requests to resign. But this time, Selby realized that Jimmie was not to be put off. What had begun as a temporary job in 1934 had lasted 18 years. Roger Selby decided to disperse most of his Arabian herd, keeping a few family favorites. Within 10 days, Jimmie had sold most of the horses to longtime Selby customers. The Hewitts later established Friendship Farms in East Moline, Illinois, from the Selby dispersal. In 1949, after weeks of negotiation, Selby agreed to sell Raffles to Alice Payne, who had wanted him for a long time. However, there was a stipulation. Jimmie had to accompany Raffles to his new home in California and breed him to one mare. The Deans outfitted a special Pullman Railroad car, a Palace Arms. Jimmie, Thelma, and John Payne, Alice's husband, loaded Raffles, a Raffles daughter, and his son, Raffy. Thelma was determined to make the trip in the boxcar with Raffles, but women were only allowed to ride in the passenger cars. Undaunted, Thelma sneaked aboard the boxcar and hid beneath Raffles' belly, concealed behind 10 carefully placed bales of hay. About 20 minutes after the train got underway,
she come out dusting the hay off of her. Every time we'd have to stop and take water, and she'd get back under there, and she rode that all the way to California.
They arrived in California in 5 days, on Thanksgiving, where Alice Payne had an engine waiting to take the railroad car to a point near her farm in Whittier. As soon as the mare was bred at the Paynes, they returned to Selby's, packed up, and moved their Arabians Imagita, Fela, and Argita home to Worthville, Kentucky. Although Alice Payne resisted Jimmie's advice to breed Raffles to Racine daughters, she did breed Raffles to Thelma's mare Fela to produce Fleeta, nicknamed Potty Girl, one of the Dean's Foundation mares. Jimmie and Thelma lived in Kentucky for a year and then went into partnership on a farm in Scottsville, Virginia, with a former Selby customer, Kathleen Ott. The partnership was short-lived, but the Deans remained on the farm and continued to breed their band of Arabians. In 1952, Jimmie and Thelma sold the farm and took over the management of John Perry's diverse agricultural operations in Perry Park, Owenton, and Carrollton, Kentucky. During this same time, Jimmie traveled to Cuba, judging livestock shows and exhibiting horses on the island.
They had an international show there, and the Cuban government said if we could get a bunch of horses to come down to the show and enter, they would pay the transportation over and back. So I arranged a whole caravan of horses.
From 1957 to 1962, Jimmie directed the Arabian Horse Owners Foundation as its first president. The foundation initiated horse management courses, judging clinics, and functioned as the first Arabian Horse Racing Association. Jimmie worked for the Perrys until 1962, when he established Tip Top Sales and Auction Service at Charlottesville, Virginia. He decided to hold a major consignment sale in connection with the 1963 National Championship classes in Dallas. Everybody told Jimmie that his idea wouldn't work, that he'd never get any horses consigned because breeders wanted to set their own prices.
So I decided then to advertise it, and hell, I had 200 horses consigned to it, and I went around all over the country and saw every horse and inspected it before I would take it into sale. I turned down some good horses, but I had to I had to pick to get 35 sound horses to go in that sale.
Jimmie ran several consignment and production sales and continued to advise numerous horse owners on herd management and breeding decisions. It was at the Ann McCormick estate sale in 1969 that Tom Chauncey and Wayne Newton bid $150,000 for 19-year-old Nabor.
And that's the beginning of these high prices. The whole thing went just like a grass fire.
The Farzan-Azraf cross is the hallmark of the Dean breeding program, and it happened almost by accident in 1968. Jimmie and Thelma were getting ready to drive to Scottsdale for the 1968 All-Arabian show. Their mare, Azlita, sired by Azraf out of Fleta, was in heat. Thelma made a snap decision to trailer Azlita to Arizona and arranged to have her bred to Dan Gainey's stallion, Farzan.
So we took her along and told Dan what we wanted to do. He said, well, that's fine. He said, how about doing it on every other foal basis? Oh, he said, I'm going to get the first filly at her. I said, that's fine with me. We never had any disagreement for 40 years. He took the mare home with him, and then the next spring he called me up and he said, your mare had a stud colt. I said, well, how do you like him? Looks to me like he's going to be a winner. And that's when he was about 5 or 6 hours old. And then in about 2 weeks he called me up. He said, how about let me just keep this stud colt and you take the filly? I said, that's fine with me.
That colt was Gay Parada, who with his sire Farzan were important stallions for Gainey Arabians. Gay Parada was named 1974 U.S. National Champion Pleasure Driving Horse and 1977 U.S. National Champion Stallion. The Dean's son, called Pete all his life, died in March 1981. Thelma died in May of the following year. Pete's daughter, Melody Ellen Daniel, will carry on the Dean's breeding program. Melody Ellen, whose nickname is Pooh, expects to continue her grandparents' program with the stallion Sansaray and Sons of Dreamazon, bred to daughters and granddaughters of Fleta and Silky. Pooh experienced her grandfather's breeding philosophy firsthand.
I learned a lot from reading the history of the early cattle, the Herefords and the Angus, and also from my grandfathers in breeding horses. And then I had a good fortune to be on a close friendship basis with a number of veterinarians. What little breeding I've done, I've tried to adhere to some very strict standards in it, and disposition is right at the top of the list. The first and most important of it is the soundness of the horse and the correctness of the horse. And then be very careful and very selective and keep only the best ones.
And along with this knowledge comes a special gift that may be passed on through the generations of people who love the Arabian horse. The gift to communicate with these magnificent creatures. Jimmie tells a story about an incident that occurred in 1986. It was breeding season. Jimmie went into the barn to fetch a 3-year-old colt. The owner's son warned Jimmie that the colt was rambunctious.
I brought this horse out of the stall, and he commenced to screaming. And I just hit him with the back of my hand on his jaw like that, and I said, cut it out. And he shut right up, and I walked him clear down out the front door. Night when Daddy came in, he said, Daddy says, can Jimmie talk horse language? And he said, well, I don't know why. He said, well, when Jeb come out that stall there and started rushing out and screaming, said Jimmie said something to him, and you know he never opened his mouth till he got clear out to that pasture. He said, well, I guess he can talk horse.
He can.
But Jimmie values another attribute more than horsemanship skills. To quote from Jimmie Dean, never go back on your word or agreement. Integrity is your greatest asset.